Most of our contemporaries associate medieval Europe with extremely romantic moments, brave knights, beautiful ladies, wanderings and exploits. All this is glorified in movies and fiction, but they do not say a word about the other side of this very difficult period in the life of mankind. For example, the fact that in the Middle Ages few people lived to be 30, or what medieval Europe really smelled like. A little spoiler: it is not about the smell of faraway wanderings and great feats. Almost all medieval European cities were very dirty. Paved streets were very rare, making the roads more like a muddy mess. Only the inhabitants of large cities could boast of having a water supply, and not all of them, and the source of drinking water was often fountains. Although, of course, such water was hardly suitable for drinking, as, however, was water from rivers and public wells, in which the remains of dead animals, cats, dogs, and even rats were often found. There was no proper sewerage system in the Middle Ages, so all liquid waste and sewage was poured out of windows directly into the city streets, and sometimes passers-by became victims of the stinking shower. Because of such actions, not only the sewers, but also the streets themselves stank horribly and were a source of spreading all sorts of contagion. And since cleaning was not a frequent phenomenon, you can imagine what monstrous diseases could be caught just by walking down the street. Water supply, as well as sewerage, was a rare phenomenon in houses, so instead of a full-fledged wash or shower, even wealthy citizens were forced to limit themselves to wiping themselves with a wet towel. It is a curious fact: the poor, paradoxically, had much better hygiene than the upper classes. The fact is that ordinary people were not a stranger to washing in rivers and ponds, while the nobility refused such water procedures, preferring not to wash at all than anywhere else. Of course, there were public baths in the Middle Ages, but since the 16th century, interest in them has slowly waned. Historians explain it for two reasons. Firstly, public baths were severely criticized by the church. And how could it be? Bathing altogether is obviously sinful. And secondly, baths were the main place where you could get syphilis. The same, extremely unpleasant consequence of an ordinary bath. Therefore, all water procedures aimed at maintaining personal hygiene were tried to be carried out at home. People bathed in tubs, and basins. Improvised baths were usually set up in the kitchen, close to the hearth. Steam rooms were also set up there from time to time. Full-fledged bathrooms appeared only in the 16th century, and toilets with the possibility of flushing water even later. By the way, even with the advent of normal toilets, not just holes in the floor, their use was not immediately mandatory. Even in the Louvre, at the court of the French kings, there was no toilet. People went to the toilet almost everywhere, in the courtyard, on staircases, and even on balconies. When they needed to go out, courtiers simply squatted on the window sill by an open window, or asked for a night vase to be brought to them, the contents of which were then poured out into the backyard. In Versailles, the situation with uncleanliness was even worse. During the reign of Louis XIV, the court ladies of the Palace of Versailles, if the need arose, and sometimes it could arise even during the service in the chapel or cathedral, were allowed to cope with small and not so small needs in a corner, in fact, without leaving the room. It is a well-known story that once the Spanish ambassador arrived at Louis's house and went into his bedchamber and felt very unwell. In the king's chambers smelled so that the ambassador had to immediately run outside to get some fresh air. What was his surprise when he found in the park, adjacent to the palace, the absence of this very fresh air. The bushes planted all around the park served as a toilet for all the courtiers, and the servants poured there the filth from the night vases. Any corner of the palace and territories was used for going to the toilet. For this purpose, the walls of palaces were equipped with drapes, and niches were made in the corridors. And it would seem, what was the need for all these tricks, if it is easier to equip a real toilet? But such a solution never even occurred to anyone. Diarrhea was the culprit. This trouble was a constant companion of medieval man, and it could appear at any moment. and there was no time to look for a toilet. It is a curious fact that the king, his family and courtiers occasionally left the palace for a while, and then it was properly cleaned and ventilated. Such measures did not help much, but at least one could stay in the palace without fear of suffocation from the stench. Frankly speaking, the odors that reigned in medieval Europe would sweep any modern man off his feet. The city air was literally saturated with the odor of rot, filth, and unwashed and sometimes rotting bodies. This is how the atmosphere of late medieval European cities was described by the writer Patrick S. Skine. The streets stank of shit, the backyard stank of urine, the stairwell stank of rotting wood and rat droppings, the kitchens of spoiled coal and mutton fat. The unventilated rooms stank of musty dust, the bedrooms of greasy sheets, damp spring mattresses, and the acrid sweet smell of night pots. People stank of sweat and worn clothes, of rotten teeth in their mouths, of onion soup in their bellies, and of old cheese and sour milk and cancer if they were not young enough. Rivers stank, squares stank, churches stank under bridges and in palaces. The peasant stank like a priest, the apprentice of a craftsman stank like the master's wife. The whole nobility stank, and even the king stank like a wild animal, and the queen like an old goat, both in summer and winter. If you liked the video, then don't forget to put a like and subscribe to the channel. There will be a lot of interesting, shocking, and exciting things ahead.